Hi, my name is Mike Rust. I'm the Aquaculture Steering Group Chair for ICES, and today I want to talk to you about working toward an ecosystem approach to North Atlantic marine aquaculture and just introduce you to what ICES is doing in the area of aquaculture. First of all, a brief outline. I want to take a look at the current status and growth of aquaculture. I want to give you a working definition of what we've come up with of an ecosystem approach based on FAO's initial definition. I'll introduce you to the ICES working groups that make up the Aquaculture Steering Group, talk about a couple of workshops, and then I want to look forward a little bit and talk about the process that ICES is developing to take aquaculture science to aquaculture advice, and that's our focus for the coming year. And then a few other areas to look forward in ICES aquaculture. And I put up the Sustainable Development Goals from UN, and I think one way to look at the gaps in ocean sciences related to aquaculture is through the lens of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Aquaculture has a role in addressing the majority of them, beyond the obvious zero hunger and life below water, SDGs 2 and 14. As a science-based industry, all types of educational opportunities exist. For example, SDG 4, as a new food producing activity, there's a chance to consider equality from the start, SDGs 5 and 10. It can provide a decent work and economic growth, SDG 8, and can be a platform for innovation, as SDG 9 points out. Marine aquaculture can produce food with reduced needs for freshwater, addressing SDG 6, and with a relatively small environmental footprint, which is SDG 12. Some forms of marine aquaculture, such as seaweeds, may even one day provide biofuels that do not compete for food, called out in SDG 7. But the main SDGs that will be positively impacted by marine aquaculture are 1, 2, 13, and 14. As we consider ocean science gaps for marine aquaculture, it's good to keep in mind these main sustainable development goals that we're trying to address. Aquaculture is a growth story. I think many of us have already seen this, but over the years, as wild capture fisheries have come to a maximum and leveled off, aquaculture continues to grow. It's still growing at about a 5.8% annual rate, down from the 10 double-digit growth of a few decades ago, but in terms of the total amount, it's still keeping pace with consumption. Right now, in 2016, aquaculture produced 110 million metric tons. About 80 million metric tons were animals, 30 million metric tons were plants or algae. This is hundreds of billions of dollars, as you can see on the graph. But it's not evenly distributed. 98% of that comes from Asia. As you can see in the middle, that's 70 million metric tons out of the 80 million metric tons total is produced in Asia. The ICES region, which includes Europe and the Americas, only produces about 8%, somewhere a little over 6 million metric tons of the 80 million metric tons produced. So it's not distributed, and I think this points out to a big difference between the PICES region and the ICES region. ICES region is still looking at future development of aquaculture largely, whereas in the PICES region we're looking at aquaculture which already exists. So we do approach aquaculture in ICES through an ecosystem approach, and it's important to note that FAO does have a definition from about a decade ago, and it's just basically that an ecosystem approach is a strategy for the integration of the activities within the wider ecosystem in such a way that it promotes sustainable development, equality and resilience of interlinked social and ecological systems. Key elements here are that it's an approach or a strategy, not a prescription. Societies need to do this to fit their own circumstances. It's within the wider ecosystem. In other words, it's geographically bound and occurs within a space. It's about development, going back to the Sustainable Development Goals. Those are goals of ecosystem-based approaches, and it should be a means to an end. And it includes equity. So it includes both the social and the environmental aspects. It considers resiliency, which in my mind is the way we need to start thinking about climate change and how we're going to get through the impacts that climate change will bring upon us. And finally, it reaffirms the social by ecological systems. Humans are a part of it. Society is a part of the ecosystem. However, after 10 years after this publication now, FAO has gone back and revisited it. And in that document from 2018, they basically said that the review suggests that mainstreaming of the ecosystem approach to aquaculture and planning process has raised awareness of how useful it is to be holistic and participatory in its approaches. However, it's had varying degrees of resonance and uptake within different user groups. What has emerged is an emphasis on spatial planning. It's developed as a key part of the ecosystem approach to aquaculture implementation, and there are definitely now close links between ecosystem approach to aquaculture and initiatives such as Blue Growth. Going forward, there's significant opportunities for the future use of this approach. I think, to me, this says that we aren't there yet, but that the pieces exist among different attempts to operationalize the EEA. It's a great start, but it's up to different countries, different regions, and different science organizations to operationalize in a way to organize research groups. So within ICES, for the purposes of our definition, and to try to tackle this very large amorphous concept, we organize an aquaculture approach as a systematic approach to aquaculture management that's in a geographically specific area, contributes to resiliency and sustainability of an ecosystem. It recognizes a whole bunch of different interrelationships between the physical or oceanographic, biological, economic, and social segments. Not only the marine systems, but also the terrestrial components, especially in aquaculture, because there is a lot of connections between the two, especially when you consider feeds. Humans are definitely a part of it. And I think this fourth one, optimize benefits among a diverse set of societal goals, is put last, but I think that's maybe the most important part, is that you really are talking about looking at trade-offs and how to do that so that you get the best mix of these various users or various approaches to using marine space or marine ecosystems to get the maximum benefits. Incidentally, developing this framework is one of the tasks of one of our newer working groups on scenario planning on aquaculture. And I will just try to point out as I go through where some of the ICES groups fit in, and also attempt to go through them one by one later on in the presentation. All aquaculture working groups at ICES work on these number 2 and number 3 areas. The resiliency and sustainability, the interrelations between physical, biological, and economic components are important from a genetics perspective, from a disease perspective, from a nutrient flow perspective, also social and economic perspective, and other environmental interactions. But our ability to move from an approach to management to actual ecosystem-based management really won't come until we can do this optimizational benefits part. This is also, I think, where we can make the most progress on resiliency to climate and other environmental changes, because until you know all the options, until you have a way to evaluate those side by side, it's hard to understand how to create resiliency in the system, and it's also hard to understand what the true vulnerabilities of the larger system is. So, where are we? Do we have an ecosystem approach to aquaculture in the ICES region? I'm going to say maybe we do, at least a start to it. And the reason I'm saying that is because we regulate using environmental and social laws. Very few of the countries, if any, have an actual aquaculture law or an aquaculture plan that supersedes the myriad of laws that are set out for environmental and social protection. Industries in the ICES region have to comply with and follow laws that are set up for fisheries, including protection of their habitats. Some jurisdictions have marine mammal protection laws. Many of them have endangered species acts or endangered or species at risk laws. We have uniformly clean water, water quality act or water quality laws, air quality laws. There's a number of food safety and food quality laws which govern aquaculture. And then there's truth in marketing, truth in advertising laws that apply, and so on. So to a certain extent, the legal system in the ICES region sets itself up fairly well for starting out with an ecosystem approach. How these laws align among ICES countries is one of the subjects of the Working Group on Environmental Interactions of Aquaculture, which I'll discuss a little bit later. The other reason why we have, I think, a good basis for developing an ecosystem approach is that we have a lot of shared environmental and social values. These I would characterize as not laws themselves, but soft laws, in that consumers and citizens that are around aquaculture facilities have a very large say in the success of those activities. Industry has to sell products and get social permission to operate. That includes things like minimizing impacts on the environment, even if it's not legally required to. Maximize positive impacts on the economy, is fair and honest, follows laws, produces healthy and local seafood is becoming more important, provides other benefits to society, maybe somewhat intangible or maybe direct, and more looks after animal welfare issues. And to compound all this, again, going back to that first slide, the ICES region imports the vast majority of our seafood. The values and economics among ICES countries and their measurement is one of the subjects of the Working Group on Social and Economic Dimensions of Aquaculture. So I wanted to provide an example, and this is an academic example of what an ecosystem approach to aquaculture might look like using our definition and in the ICES context. And so this is a paper from Sarah Lester and colleagues where she looks at using marine spatial planning, so again it's geographically centered, to make room for offshore aquaculture in crowded coastal waters, and she uses the Southern California Bight. I think it does a good job and is where we need to go more broadly. It couples marine spatial analysis with trade-off analysis to look at how aquaculture could develop in this region with minimum negative impacts on other users of the ocean, so other societal users, or the environment, so it also integrates into the ecosystem. Actually, it should be possible to develop aquaculture in a way that has net benefits to other sectors of society and the environment. However, building the scientific effort and structures needed to do this in an operational sense is more difficult, but is where we need to go, and it's where we're trying to go on ICES. One of the findings of this paper, and I think why it is so powerful, is they were able to identify over 250,000 different marine spatial analysis solutions that generated significant seafood supply and billions of dollars in revenue with really minimal impacts, less than 1% on existing sectors or on the environment. So moving on to the 7 groups that make up the Aquaculture Steering Group. The Aquaculture Steering Group consists of the chairs of each of these 7 groups and then the steering group chair, which is my role. The Aquaculture Steering Group is responsible for guiding and supporting these expert groups that are working on the science and advisory topics contributing to the sustainable development of aquaculture. They include the evaluating the social and economic dimensions of aquaculture, the types, the transmission, prevalence of diseases affecting cultured species, and actions that can be taken to address and minimize them. Understanding positive and negative environmental impacts of aquaculture, approaches to monitor and mitigate them, and methods of aquaculture risk assessment. Issues of carrying capacity and the relative efficiencies of alternative aquaculture systems, including integrated multitrophic or siting of aquaculture in areas where it can provide a net benefit to ecosystem services. The genetics of cultured species and the application of molecular techniques to aquaculture questions. Genetics being both the selective breeding part of it to improve aquaculture, as well as the risks posed by escaped aquaculture organisms on their wild cousins. And then also looking to the future, projecting the future developments of aquaculture and implications for the bigger food system and for food and nutritional security. The first group is the working group on application of genetics in fisheries and aquaculture. This is chaired by Jan Martensen. They provide advice on methods to describe, conserve, and manage biodiversity, focusing on the application of genetics and genomic analysis. This group applies to management needs spanning commercial fisheries, ecosystems, recreational exploitation, as well as aquaculture, so it's not strictly an aquaculture group. But currently, this group is reviewing the genetic and genomic approaches for quantifying indirect genetic impacts of escaped salmon from aquaculture on wild salmon populations. They're reviewing the principles of and prospects for genomic selection approaches applied to aquaculture species. And they're looking at the use of genetic and genomic tools for identifying species in mixed landings, fish products and byproducts for understanding what's in the market. And they're investigating now the use of eDNA methods and how those can be applied to ecosystem monitoring and fisheries management. The working group on pathology and diseases of marine organisms is one of the core groups, long-standing groups at ICES, dating back into the 1980s. Core focus of this group is to provide annual updates on new trends and occurrences of diseases in farmed and wild aquatic organisms. Updates are provided by national experts for each representative country, meaning that this group has access to the most up-to-date and relevant information on disease trends. These trends are periodically reviewed, and reports are issued that summarize the changes in disease prevalence over a range of years. Last year, the group published 2 new leaflets, number 69 and 70, on pathology and diseases of marine organisms. The group also is forward-looking, looking at issues of disease prevention and management. And so, for example, this group sponsored a workshop on emerging pathogens of mollusks, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. The working group on social and economic dimensions of aquaculture addresses the question of how to balance negative and positive socio-economic consequences of aquaculture development. The search for solutions in the sector to meeting production, income, community development of food supply and security needs is critical for ICES countries as well as the global structure. This group identifies and develops methods to determine socioeconomic effects. They assess and identify trajectories of socioeconomic concerns. They identify knowledge transfer processes that are available and employed for socioeconomic of aquaculture, and then they try to keep tab on new and emerging issues. They currently have 2 review papers coming out, one applying indicators to capture the social dimensions of aquaculture, and one on availability and usefulness of economic data on the effects of aquaculture. Next year, this group is going to turn its attention to examining the effectiveness of knowledge transfer approaches across the ICES region. Working group on scenario planning of aquaculture is looking at meeting global versus EU aquaculture targets. This aims to understand how international targets for aquaculture growth, which need to double, compare to EU country targets for growth, both industry and government published targets. The difference is going to help illuminate how or if EU member nations will be able to contribute to global landings or global aquaculture production, or conversely, how much they will have to expect from other parts of the world, such as Asia, to expand aquaculture to achieve these global targets. The working group on environmental interactions of aquaculture is in the process of aligning the legal and management approaches for both shellfish and finfish aquaculture among the countries of ICES to allow sharing of best practices and highlight areas that need more work. This is a large effort with spreadsheets covering all impacts of marine aquaculture and how different countries are dealing with them. This group actually included representation from China as well as ICES countries. Next steps for this group will be to explore commonalities and best practices for risk assessment and trade-off analysis. Formal risk assessments are a well-established tool for developing science-based advice in aquaculture and other areas of resource management. We are benchmarking those to come up with what works well across the ICES region. Finally, this group will develop recommendations for research to address management of environmental interactions of aquaculture more generally. The working group on ecological carrying capacity is a new group, just got started. This group is reviewing existing methods for estimating ecological carrying capacity to produce guidelines for considering aquaculture scenarios under different geographic scales and conditions. Their work will increase our understanding of how nutrients flow through wild and aquaculture production scenarios in different habitats, and how the ecological relationships and trade-offs could be affected. In doing so, identifying critical data gaps and developing recommendations for addressing them in light of maximizing ecosystem services through sustainable aquaculture will be drawn out. The working group on open ocean aquaculture is focused on, obviously, the open ocean. As the demand for products from aquaculture is constantly increasing, and thus the supply of operational space in coastal areas is limited, there are worldwide efforts now to move aquaculture into the open ocean. Central expectations for these offshore transformations is that the rearing of aquatic organisms could take place in marine areas where more space is available, stakeholders' conflicts are less, and better water quality exists. As a result, new aquaculture production areas have been identified that either lie further out in the open ocean, or on the other hand, areas that are not far from the mainland but are subject to harsh weather conditions. This leads to a field of research commonly referred to open ocean aquaculture, offshore aquaculture, or sometimes exposed aquaculture. This working group has a number of things they're focused on. One is basically the role of environmental influences in terms of marine flora and fauna, ecosystems, and habitat will be different in the open ocean than the near shore. One area that this we may find is in terms of interactions with large marine mammals like whales, possibly turtles, which is a new area in terms of we don't really think about that as an issue for aquaculture too much. The technical challenges and specific system design requirements, engineering, the concepts of marine multi-use and site selection, need to be hammered out, and especially economic aspects, which is pretty unknown for these large systems that are now being built in Norway and China and elsewhere. The group will work out concepts for site-specific solutions that will enable sustainable development of offshore aquacultures. The goal is to form inter- and transdisciplinary groups of biologists, engineers, economists, spatial planners, managers, and people from the industry, as well as regulators, in order to develop a roadmap for future aquaculture at open ocean locations. We also conduct workshops. There were two, and that should be 2019, sorry. One is a workshop on emerging mollusk pathogens. Emergence of the microvar variants of the Ostrid herpes virus, OSHV1, have caused significant Pacific oyster mortality from Europe to Australia, New Zealand, and is probably the most significant mollusk disease development in decades. Preventing further spread of these pathogens and mitigating damage in affected areas are twin challenges of the microvar management today. This workshop identifies strategies to prevent microvariant dispersal to North American member countries. Presently, North America is free of these microvars, and to maintain commercial production should an epizootic emerge. It also more broadly considered the microvar emergence as a case study in responding to emerging viral and bacterial pathogens to identify general strategies for future responses and potential pitfalls with our current efforts in terms of managing disease epizootics. ICES workshop addressed fundamental questions regarding capabilities in terms of expertise and infrastructure, communication among the pathology community, regulators, and industry. We sought to identify areas warranting investment and support to manage emerging disease threats in shellfish, and provide justification for resources to be directed toward these areas for more efficient management. 36 priorities were identified spanning these four areas: communication, frameworks, essential infrastructure, key research priorities, and the central role of husbandry in shellfish aquaculture health management. So I'll go on. The other one, the value of genetic and genomic tools for identifying species and mixed landings, fish products and byproducts. I mentioned that as one of the approaches by the genetics working group earlier. This is really an opportunity for them to work with the stakeholders and move that technology developed in the working group into actual use by the EU society that needs to use those tools. One thing unique about ICES is that they have this advice process. It has a unique role to provide science-based advice to its member governments and intergovernmental organizations. This is common in fisheries and ecosystems, but is just at the planning stages for aquaculture. Moving from science to advice for aquaculture is going to be the focus for the Aquaculture Steering Group in 2020. We plan on first reviewing the types of advice that several countries give, the requirements under ICES countries and EU information quality laws, survey the ICES delegates for their needs, and then conduct a workshop this spring or summer to develop the process and products that will become ICES aquaculture advice. Looking forward, we're thinking about potential new groups. One, potentially looking at climate change, both the vulnerabilities and resiliencies of aquaculture to climate change, hopefully in a larger context of food security. Again, the turning science into advice for aquaculture is going to be a major focus, as I just explained. And then we'll begin thinking about training opportunities, especially probably around the areas of risk assessment, but potentially other things. So I hope you enjoyed this brief introduction to the ICES Aquaculture Steering Group and our attempts at creating an ecosystem-based approach and how we're going about it. I look forward to working with you in the next year or two and seeing what PICES is up to. Thank you.